Well, welcome everyone to Anxiety Simplified podcast. I'm Joanne Williams, and we're here today really to share powerful strategies I've used with my clients as a 30-year mental health professional to lower anxiety simply. And in bringing this right into your own homes now, we really hope that this can make your life just a little happier and less stressed with what we discuss today. And so today we do have a special guest I'm going to introduce in just a moment, Simon Chadwick, who has a book for the people. It's a citizen's manifesto to shaping our nation's future. And with all the things going on today, I think this is just so important that we all listen to this and take some notes about what we each can do. And because this is so timely, I want to put a date and a time with this because when we talked about this before, there hadn't been an insurrection, there hadn't been a second impeachment. So today is January 14th, 2021, when we are recording this. And we are in a time that 1 week and 1 day ago, there was an armed insurrection at our Capitol. And our current president, Trump, has now been impeached twice. Never before has that happened. And because there is so much to discuss with Simon, I will be breaking this podcast up into two sections. Part one on kind of what's going on and just a discussion around it and what we can do individually supporting our country and constitution with the least amount of stress in section two. So, summary of today's podcast: 5 strategies we can use to bring our leaders back into our liberty goals for the pursuit of happiness. As we all know in our Constitution, it states. And so we will talk more about the strategies in part two, and that I hope you can use in your daily life to lower your stress or worry when confronted by I'm going to call them antisocial persons, whether they're at work, maybe your neighbor, maybe it's your cousin. So there's a lot to talk about. So a summary of today is the basic contract that, and Simon's going to talk about this from his book. I really want to hear more details about this, but the basic contract that exists in our democracy that we hold dear, that we may have forgotten, we have to work from, and how fragile this contract is. I think we're really seeing that. When an authoritarian or dictator type leader tries as he might to hold on to power, and how fear can really be used to divide us, but security to unite us. And then in part two, more about how authoritarian rulers all have kind of a psychopathic or a psychopathology that drives their need to be right, and their mindset when it's challenged it's really at the very core of who they are. And that's kind of what we've seen. If you've noticed, challenging this current president has just, he needed yes people around him anyway. So, but really at this point, looking at some of those characteristics, and as I've done some of the research for this, I see that 20% of our corporate leaders have these qualities. So there may be more to this that we can use in your everyday life if you're not truly a completely political person. And then ways to deal with our leaders and the organizations or politicians and this social tendencies that we do see in some of our leaders or even corporate leaders. And question of the day: how can we be more open and have conversations between Democrats, Republicans, and just Americans in general to have more of a common reality, an American tribe of the same values? So today, my guest is Simon Chadwick. He's a South African-born, British-educated American citizen. He grew up as a son of a prominent anti-apartheid activist, lived in two totalitarian societies, South Africa and Kenya. He is a career CEO or in Italy, UK, and US, and owner of a firm of management consultants, but intensely interested and concerned about our politics and society in our modern day America, as I am. And I'm just kind of a political hack of sorts that just loves to debate and discuss. So, I mean, Simon's going to really be more of the expert here, and I just enjoy the conversation. But I want to introduce him and his book, For the People, and a citizen's manifesto to shaping our nation's future. And I hope you kind of take us through that, Simon, for them to get your book to be more of a guide for us right now.
Certainly.
So, hello, Simon, and so nice to have you here. So, tell us more about how you got into this and why you wrote the book and more about your story.
Well, thank you, Joanne, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast. It's wonderful. So, yes, as you said, I was born in South Africa to he was a missionary at the time, and he went on to he was elected the Episcopal Bishop of pretty much the whole of northwestern South Africa, based in a city called Kimberley, which is the Diamond City of Africa. This was during the the mid 1970s through to the early 1980s. And South Africa was, as you pointed out, an apartheid system, which was a system that was written into law of people being kept separate and one set of people being kept subservient to another. That meant, for example, that if you were an African, you had to live in African areas which were outside of the cities, either rural or in what are called townships, that you had to have a pass, a document allowing you into those cities, that you had no human rights to speak of, and that you were constantly in fear of violence, fear of losing your job, of being lynched, whatever it may be. During that time, the government, which was primarily Afrikaner, which means of Dutch and French Huguenot origin, and who speak a language called Afrikaans, which is ancient Dutch, decided that all school children in the country, including Africans, would only be taught in Afrikaans, which was the language of the oppressor. So school children all over the country, African school children, went on strike. And they boycotted the schools. And this went on for over a year.
Can I ask the ages? Yeah. So these young children at high school, or, what ages was this?
K1 through 12.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds organized.
It was organized. And there was a very strong secret police presence in South Africa. So strong that, if I could just say to you that our house was totally bugged. We couldn't discuss anything inside our house. We'd go down to the bottom of the yard if we wanted to say anything.
Or what would happen? I mean, for Americans, it's heard of course, but more in espionage or whatever. But in a home, what would they do to you, or could happen?
Well, what could happen is what did happen in the end, which was my father was arrested and imprisoned. And eventually
for talking against the government.
For talking and acting against the government. Yeah. Long story short, my father's priests and a number of other people managed to persuade the children to go back to work in his diocese, go back to school. The secret police, who were not particularly the brightest bulbs in the chandelier, took from this that the priests must know who the organizers were. And so they arrested them, all of them. One of them died under interrogation by falling out of a 7th-story window. My dad basically rang the church bells continuously for 3 months so that the police would hear them wherever they went. He put a cross a day outside the cathedral for every day that the priests were in custody. He preached. He spoke 11 languages, 4 of them South African languages. He would preach to stadiums of 20, 25,000 people. He would repeat the sermon in English, Setswana, Sesotho, and Afrikaans, the last one just to make sure the security police understood what he was saying. And eventually on Easter Sunday in 1982, he was arrested. Now, I tell you all of this because basically, what we were living through was a situation of great fear, of great insecurity. Obviously, if you were African, you had massive insecurity, personal insecurity, but the whites were living through insecurity as well. They never knew when there would be a revolution. And one of the miracles of South Africa is that there wasn't a bloody revolution. And so I experienced that there. I experienced it again in Kenya under Kenyatta when I was a teacher there. People, his opponents, the Joe Biden of Kenya disappeared and was never seen again. And they used to take these people up into what were called the Ingong Hills outside Nairobi and shoot them, basically, and leave their bodies up there. So again, great insecurity, great fear. Now I studied politics at Oxford, got a master's in it. And as you said, I've had a corporate career for many, many years. But I've lived in this country for 30 years. And around about 2015, I could see the red flags beginning to go up. I could smell from my previous experience what was beginning to happen. This mantra that all dictators or would-be dictators have, everything is terrible. It's all the fault of, Mexicans, Muslims, blacks, whatever you want to put in there as your favorite bogeyman. Only I can make it better, and then everything will be wonderful. That was it raised so many flags that I then started to research and write the book through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because that is so much about security. And security comes from the word in Latin securitas, which means absence of fear.
And let's stop there and describe more about what Maslow's hierarchy of need is, because he was a psychologist, as I remember. And it is like freedom from fear is really part of it. But first you have to have your basic needs met, really, before you can even, like food, water, shelter, before you can even go to safety needs, that really need employment and resources and health and, property, before you can even go to loving other people or belonging to different societies or groups or whatever you want, till you can go into the part that he called esteem, of respect, self-esteem, recognition, strength, and freedom to get to what he called self-actualization, or really a desire to become the most you possibly could be. So that's kind of the stages. So just want to set that up as you compare this a little bit to what you're seeing, what you were seeing on this and describing it through Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, that's a wonderful summary, Joanne, of the hierarchy. So I started to understand that in the America of today, fear is never very far away. It can be as visceral as being the wrong skin color in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it can also be just purely existential. For example, if you get really sick, and you can't pay the bills, and so you go bankrupt and you lose your home and you become homeless. There's that residual fear in everybody, of that happening to them, or of unemployment and no social security, or not being able to have your retirement. I was talking with a young man in his 30s the other day, similar thing to this podcast, and he was saying, I don't think I'm going to have social security when I get old. It's not going to be there for me. And it was a fear, a real fear. I also realized, though, that what was happening was that some politicians, were expressly stoking that fear and expressly putting the blame on other people, and that they were targeting those who had been taken for granted or left aside. And I'm thinking particularly here of those in factory towns, for example, whose factory left town and was moved overseas.
The
People,
steel industry.
yes, and coal, and yes,
coal,
all of that.
clothing.
And yeah, and it's fair to say, whichever side of the aisle you're on, that these people had essentially been ignored. The fear translated for them into things like opioid addiction and meth addiction, as they saw their communities gutted, their schools closed, their fire stations closed, their supermarkets disappear. And they were angry, rightly so, really angry. And it was to them that Trump appealed. And so fear mutated into anger. To round this off, what I started to think about as I looked at this and looked at it through Maslow was, what is the contract between government and the electorate? How does that contract differ?
Say that again. The contract between whom and whom?
The government and the electorate.
And the electorate, you mean like
Yes.
the people or
The
the
people.
actual okay.
Yeah, the people. And
Okay.
what is it that's missing in that contract right now? And I started to look at other countries and their models and how they ruled themselves, which was successful, why they were successful, and tried to learn lessons that we could bring here. So that was the basis for the book. And as you said earlier, what I want for the book to do is to enable conversations to be started.
Good. and it's like there is so much going on right now, and it's like, what conversation, which conversation, how do we start, where do we have a conversation? Because I love this premise, and I think we should actually talk a little bit about that contract, because let's start there, and then we maybe can use that as we have a discussion wherever we want to start with this. But what have you seen from other countries, or what have you seen as you've done this book about what the actual contract is between government and the people?
So, in a functioning democracy, a well-functioning democracy, the contract is very, very simple. You, the people, you get to elect the government, and your responsibility is to pay taxes and obey reasonable laws. The government's responsibility is to set up a framework of security in which you can flourish, in which you can belong, in which you can feel you belong, and achieve that self-actualization that you were talking about. The interesting thing about America is that contract has eroded, and it's very strong in a number of countries, particularly Scandinavian countries such as Iceland, Norway, Denmark, also Holland, even to a certain extent Germany, certainly in New Zealand and Australia to a certain extent, where where there is more of a communal sort of attitude, communal culture, where people are actually they naturally look to the well-being of society
First.
over their own. Here, I think, especially since the 1980s, but probably throughout our history, but especially since the 1980s, it's me first. You can go to hell. And that has come through in our policies. When Reagan said the problem is government, he essentially shot a hole in the bows of the ship of government. To the extent that we don't provide a health service that is tremendous. People may think we've got a great health service. Yeah, in parts we do, but we spend well over twice what other countries do on health. We are way down the middle of the pack in terms of health outcomes. Similarly, education.
And I would say for women in health and color and deaths from birth, we are next to last.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some of the worst healthcare for women in birth right now, and it's decreasing. And for women of color, it's one of the lowest in the world. It's frightening, and I've got to say, there's a piece of discrimination for people, women of color as well as women. And
Yes.
they're not taken seriously. So there's a lot of layers to what you are talking about. And I've got to say something about with Reagan. I really do remember that. Was that in the 70s, late 70s?
Late 70s, early 80s. Yes.
Because I remember my ex-husband, my first husband, was part of the there was a medical system for Navy people or merchant Marines that they could go get dental care, health care. That was almost free. It wasn't completely. He demolished it. We were like, oh my gosh, it was devastating. We were fishermen, family, but we were still included in that. And that I could see that beginning of that fear, when you don't have enough money to take care of your teeth or your health. It does start. I'm hearing that word erosion that you used, and I just remember that feeling of losing that. And I've truly seen it ever since, with every part of mental health. With Reagan, that's when the mental health institutions, the doors were open, and really pretty much as a brand new mental health professional at that point, seeing bus loads of people just dropped off in the streets from a mental institution.
Yes.
It was, and expecting the community to take care of them was his word. Big government, doesn't have this responsibility. It's communities that need to take this responsibility without any money, without any preparation, without any system. And I feel like still to this day, that is why we do not have a mental health. I wouldn't call it a system.
I would totally agree with you. It was very interesting that Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were big buddies. And at the same time as Reagan was doing that, so she was doing the same in the UK. And she famously said, there is no such thing as society.
Oh.
That was, at the core of her beliefs.
So she said there was no such thing as society?
Yes.
What would that mean? I can't even get my head around that one.
We're just a bunch of individuals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. On your own. And there's no need for any government to take care of anybody. Take care of yourself.
Yeah. That basically. Okay. That was the point at which I think, some societies, such as the US and to a certain extent the UK, started to diverge from others. It's really interesting. I mean, you can take big things like healthcare, and you can point to single-payer systems that actually are more effective, more efficient, and you remove the fear factor in the population. If people get ill, they're not going to go bankrupt. They're not going to lose their home.
Okay.
But it's also in the little things. It's in the logic of decision making. So we talked about those Rust Belt cities, for example, and the factories leaving, there was no support, no retraining budgets, no place where people could go. If the same thing happens in Denmark, not only will the government pay the salary that you had for a certain amount of time, it will pay for retraining, it will find you the retraining resources, and if you then get a job, it will pay to relocate you. Now, people, a lot of people on the right would say that's socialism, that's spending our money, how dare you? But actually, it's so much more cost effective.
Right.
So much more cost effective because, then you don't have the opioid crisis, the meth crisis, the collapse of these towns and cities.
But you are getting at something, again, as a mental health provider, that I've also witnessed and seen. And I don't know what else to call it, but I feel it's meanness for a lack of I don't know, a more proper way to maybe describe this or look at this. I don't care about you. I don't care if you don't have a job. Why don't you have a job? That's you. So what? So what if you don't have health care? So what if you're homeless? There's just a level of callousness that
I don't
has
care if
come
I give you
along.
COVID. Yeah, I
Right,
don't care
the
if I give you
mask.
COVID. Yeah.
Yes, and that is the same mentality, I would say, that I have seen right through to today, to that insurrection. I don't care. I want this my way, and hell or high water. I will kill you for this. There is such an extreme of
Yeah.
this individualization, if that's what we would want to call it.
I think there is an extreme, but I think, if you go out into the population at large, I think you find far less extremity
You
than
are
you
right.
do at the top.
I would agree. And, let's talk some numbers, because you are so right. And you're reminding me here, and I think that would be something to remind everyone about, that this is a minority of people who are this way of thinking. And there's always a minority, but this has been a loud minority that has shown tendencies, and we'll get into that, to antisocial behavior. I don't care about you. And one of the people I was talking to this about it, I was thinking in the election about almost 50, a little less than 50% of the people still were looking towards what I would call Trump as a dictator or authoritarian, non-democratic way of governing, looking for power in a few and less to the people is, I guess, my definition of that. But then they reminded me it's probably more like 30 to 35%, because it is less than that. Just because 50% may have voted, it doesn't mean they are part of this extremist part.
Yes, that is, I think, very correct. And I've had conversations since the election with a number of avowed Republicans who have expressed to me their own fear and their fear of being despised, of being argued with, of being insulted by people who don't, agree with them, and that they feel that they're being shut down, and they're in pain because of it. And I try to draw the equivalence for them of the anger and the fear that people on the left had when they saw a dictator or an authoritarian president come in, and the fear that instilled in them, and the anger that they had at those who enabled them, not necessarily those who voted for them, but those who enabled this to take place.
Yeah, that's what it seems like it is.
But
Enabled.
it's interesting that that same fear is on both sides of the aisle. We need desperately leadership, competence in government that can restore a feeling of belonging, that can start to diminish that fear. And that's going to be hugely difficult, but it has to happen.
And I think that was one of our parts today that we would get into is some ways to restore belonging and unity. And with that, I'm kind of hearing you say can help to quell fears or help people feel more secure in saying something that is their opinion or saying something that might be helpful. Is that what you, a premise that you have seen?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a need for listening. It's not all on the shoulders of the people themselves. It has to
Mm,
be on the shoulders of the leaders as well. And there has to be much, much more listening at the top and much less posturing. That is going to be difficult to achieve, I believe, because of the influence of money in the electoral system nowadays, and in government as well. But there has to be leadership to make an example of how you listen and how you converse. And that example has to be in acts as well. And those acts have to restore the framework of security.
yeah, I agree. I think another piece of security that got taken out, and Elizabeth Warren spoke to that, was when we lost our unions.
Hmm.
Unions had been part of a structure, for I don't know, 100 years or whatever it was, to give more power to people, or at least more of a fair fight, maybe with corporations, or some way to be listened to and have needs heard and respected and paid a decent wage. And that's been an erosion. And that's where, in Elizabeth Warren's words, gave rise to the corporate power in government. And that has thrown this balance completely off or away from power, with the people's voices to be heard and given to corporations
Yeah.
or businesses within government.
Yes, and it's no coincidence that the in the UK the first thing that Margaret Thatcher did was to destroy the unions, in a very bloody way, and because she was attempting the same thing. But it is absolutely true that the imbalance has then meant that capital is treated far more favorably than labor. The minimum wage is really pathetic,
It is really
the federal
pathetic.
minimum wage. And as an economist, I can go into why a decent minimum wage does not harm, but
But
that's
it's
another
common sense.
Yeah, it is.
Truly,
Um,
here in Florida where I'm at, they're bringing it up to $10.
mm,
It's not even at $10 an hour. I think it's 8.50. But what can you buy with $8.50? A fancy
mm,
coffee costs 5, so or more, and you're going to work for a half an hour, not even that, for a cup of coffee. I mean, that is, and then housing. I mean, these things are just so far out of whack that, and then we can't even go there right now. I mean,
no, no,
we can't
but
even
it
start that conversation.
it feeds into insecurity.
Absolutely.
So if you're doing 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs to
Right.
keep your family afloat, then you're not there to keep to parent the kids.
Take care of kids.
You don't have health insurance, probably. So if you get sick, you're immediately behind on your rent. Your kids need somewhere to belong increasingly, there are not the facilities at schools for after hours or for sports or for arts or for drama. Those have all been cut out. So there's this massive ripple effect of insecurity that goes through the disadvantaged. And the disadvantaged, as you were saying before, are that there is a greater proportion of them that are minorities. We talk about African Americans and the history there. That would, we could go into that in terms of insecurity. But
And I
the
did in
same,
one of my other podcasts in a two-part series. Absolutely. Just driving while black. I mean,
yeah,
was part of this. And it's just, yeah, there's,
and the same for Native Americans as well.
yeah,
You
Native
know,
Americans.
um,
Oh, yes.
so all of this is interlinked, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I appreciate this conversation and I would like to stop this here. And we're going to continue this in part 2 and more about the solutions because just from what we've talked about, you can start just burying your head any moment about all the issues. And we haven't even talked really about any ways that we as individuals or as American people that just want to live our lives, what do we do to help with this security? So I'm going to we're going to come back with Simon Chadwick and we're going to talk more about what is that next step that each of us can take as American true patriots, not with these other types of flags and groups that are saying they are, and to me, they're not. So let's talk solutions. So, Simon, we're going to hold on. And just a moment, we're going to come back, everyone. So I hope you come back and listen for more about these solutions. So thank you for listening. And we really appreciate you being here. And please show your support by rating, reviewing, and subscribing to our podcast, please. Or share this with somebody who you think this might help. And remember, we want to provide you with skills here today. So, something you've heard here today, I hope you really take it in and can use it in some way in your life to really feel more joy in your life. Or contact us at anxietysimplified.net to find out more, maybe about how to get an emotional support animal to live in housing with lower anxiety, or to get a certified psychiatric service dog to go anywhere with you and fly now, the new regulations, to feel more calm. So we'll see you in just a little bit.